Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Wednesday, and that means it's time for our Coffee with PC moments together. Yes, I did say Wednesday. We made that change this week. I hope you got the message. We tried to let people know through Coffee with PC last week, through our service on Sunday, that we're changing from 2 days a week to just 1 day a week, from Tuesday and Friday to just Wednesday morning. So that's going to be the plan going forward here. Coffees with PC, kind of a midweek touching base together and enjoying a good cup of coffee. I got a new cup thanks to Brian this morning. It's a Yeti, as you see, insulated cup, which means it keeps the coffee hot, and I like it. In fact, that's one thing I like. I want my coffee hot. I don't want it lukewarm or whatever. I like to pour it and kind of get it hot, and so this cup does that. And you also know, if you've been watching for very long, I like a dark roast coffee, and so this morning I've got some Italian roast from Starbucks. It was Price that suggested this week, when we needed some coffee, to pick that up. We hadn't had it in a while, and I am glad he did, because I've quite enjoyed it this week as we've had that particular blend, Italian roast coffee. So thanks for tuning in here. I want to spend a few minutes with you today, and really we're going to pick up from our sermon, our service on Sunday. I'm sure many of you probably have listened to that. We're aware of it online. If you weren't, just real quick, we talked about the idea of brokenness in our lives that comes from the fact that we are frail, and that we fail, that we sin, and the sin that comes into our life brings a brokenness, and ultimately a brokenness of our relationship with God. And the point that I tried to make on Sunday was that brokenness can become openness that allows the grace of God into our lives. But the thing that I left out of my sermon was kind of important, and it's interesting. You know, sometimes I leave stuff out of the sermon just because I miss it in my notes as I'm preaching. I just skip right over it. And then probably there's other times where I choose to leave it out for time constraints. Don't want to belabor the point too long. But this week, I really hate that I missed this part, because this is sort of an important thing. When we talk about brokenness becoming openness to the grace of God, this idea I want to talk about today is the means by which that can happen. And that means by which brokenness becomes our openness to the grace of God is confession. It's confession. It's admitting our need for God, for His grace, admitting our failure, admitting our sin, and turning to God to receive from Him what we have proved that we can't do for ourselves. Confession is that thing that connects us to the grace of God. And there's actually a beautiful psalm, Psalm 51, that is an entire psalm of confession. It was written by David as a personal psalm of confession after his period where he had his incident with Bathsheba, and then he tried to cover it up by having her husband killed in battle, and he was just going on with his life until the prophet Nathan pointed out his great sin, and then David, heartbroken, realized that he was in fact broken, that his relationship to God was broken, that he was a broken man, and in his brokenness he writes this Psalm 51 as a confession of sin. His prayer, one of the ways I remembered it was from a song many years ago, a worship song that's kind of right out of this psalm, verses 10, 11, and 12. Create in me a pure heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit in me. Don't cast me away from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. He could use this psalm to ask God to restore, to pour His grace in to the brokenness. But to do that, he had to confess. He does that. He says in verse 3, I know my transgressions. My sin is always before me. Against you have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. He recognizes the failure, the sin in his life, and he confesses it. But the reason he can confess it is because he also knows God. He also knows the character of God. He begins this psalm this way, verse 1, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. He begins by appealing to the very nature of God. And in the NIV, he says, I appeal to your mercy, O God, according to your unfailing love. You've been around a while, you've heard me use this Hebrew word before. It's the Hebrew word for that unfailing love. It's chesed. the Hebrew word that shows this incredible love, this consistent love, this unfailing, merciful, forgiving love of God that comes out of the covenant that he made with his people, that he showed them, as we talked about on Sunday, on Mount Sinai with Moses, as he revealed himself as that gracious, merciful, just, and righteous God who wants to forgive his people. Here David turns to him and reminds himself that God is the God of unfailing love, of covenant love, of Hesed. In fact, there's a kid's Bible. It's called the Jesus Storybook Bible, and the author translates it this way. It's the never-stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love of God that David appeals to. And when he does that, what happens is he's able to see God not as this God wanting to crush and punish him for messing up, but a God who loved him and who expresses himself in love in a way that would restore. And so David is able, through confession, to acknowledge his brokenness, to acknowledge his sin, and that then allows his brokenness to in turn become openness to the work of this covenant love of God, the unfailing love of God, the never stopping, never giving up, always and forever love of God that he can pour into him. In fact, at the end of this psalm, he says this in verse 17. He says, "My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, you, God, will not despise." Yeah, there were all of these sacrifices that were prescribed for Israel. We talked about that on Sunday as well, that they were meant to be, on the one hand, sort of a way to find forgiveness, on another hand, to demonstrate the punishment for sin as the animal was sacrificed, and even particularly to Israel, a way to show the removal of guilt from sin. But David, in his moment of brokenness, realizes it's not the religious ritual of offering the sacrifices. And in fact, he says, "You do not delight sacrifice, or I would bring it. You take no pleasure in burnt offerings," verse 16. "But my sacrifice," David says, "is my broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, O God, will not despise." Because in that brokenness, in that confession of his failure, in that confession of his sin, it becomes this openness to the grace of God to come in and bring restoration. You know, Jesus, as we've talked through this series, and we've used his example of taking bread. In fact, bread has been sort of the every week symbol that Jesus multiple times in Scripture takes bread and he breaks it. He blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to his disciples. And one of the times that we know well is at what we call the Last Supper, when he takes that bread and he breaks it, having blessed it, and he offers it, and he says, "This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He wants the disciples, he wants us to remember what? The covenant love, the chesed love of God, a God who has made a provision for our forgiveness, who has ultimately through the gift of Jesus by his death and resurrection has made it possible for us, in spite of our failure, in spite of our brokenness, in spite of our sin, to be restored. When not just in the broken failure of our lives, but with a broken and contrite heart, as David says, we turn to God in confession, and God is able to pour out his grace because he's a God of this covenant love. That's why so many churches, so many Christian churches take this supper, because it's a remembrance. It's a reminder of that never-ending, never-stopping, never giving up, unbreaking, always and forever love that God has for you. So as we think about our brokenness, let's not forget that in our brokenness, God can use our confession to allow our lives to be open to his grace to pour in and bring forgiveness, because he's the God who loves. He's the God who sacrificed himself through his son Jesus on the cross so that we might know him. He's demonstrated that covenant love time and again. And so that was kind of one of the parts of the sermon on Sunday I left out. Yes, we don't want to get caught up in the bad news, as it were. of the brokenness of our lives, but that's a necessary thing to understand, because it's only as we come to truly grasp how broken we are, how sinful we are, and then we look at the contrast that is the covenant love, the unfailing love of God expressed throughout history and ultimately in Jesus, that it resolves for us the reality that the grace of God can be poured out in our lives. So those are my thoughts today, kind of finishing up something I sort of skipped over on Sunday, and I apologize for that. Hey, listen, thanks as always for popping in here for a few minutes with me now on Wednesday mornings. I hope you'll continue to do that. We'll be here with worship on Sunday. We'll have the service at 9 a.m. on Sunday. It'll be online through Facebook and a couple of other places, as well as if you prefer to come in person, you can do that. We do still ask that you register as a way to let us know who's coming, just to manage the crowds and the distancing and the like. You can do that on our website, fbckl.com. The homepage, you'll see click here to register for August 23rd service. You can go there. I won't put the link today in the notes, but you can go right there and do that. And we'll look forward to gathering. We'll finish up this series on blessed, broken, and given. We've done blessed, we've done broken, but you'll never guess what Sunday is. We'll talk about being given, and we'll use the example of Jesus as a reminder of how he gives us, how he gave himself, and then he's given us as his people, his church, to carry his message to this world. So I hope you have a great rest of your week. Here we are kind of midweek, kind of this midweek check-in. So I hope the rest of your week goes really well, and we'll look forward to connecting with you through our service on Sunday.